In January 2006, Ricky Megee, a 35-year-old Australian tradesman from Brisbane, Queensland, departed on what should have been a straightforward road trip across the remote Australian Outback. He was driving along the Bunteen Highway through the Tanami Desert in the Northern Territory, heading toward a new job opportunity in Port Hedland, Western Australia, equipped with food, water, maps, and a reliable vehicle. On January 19, 2006, somewhere between the frontier towns of Alice Springs and Port Hedland, he made a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. But by April 5th, when stockmen from Barrandudu Station spotted a skeletal figure stumbling through the scrubland, his journey had transformed into one of the most controversial and harrowing survival ordeals in modern Australian history. Ricky Megee was not a professional survivalist or an experienced bushman, but he was capable, practical, and accustomed to hard work. Born around 1970 or 1971, he had spent most of his adult life working in trades and manual labor, moving between jobs across Queensland and the Northern Territory. His background was unremarkable, in the best sense of the word. He was an ordinary Australian working man with modest ambitions and a willingness to travel where employment took him. In early 2006, an opportunity arose in Port Hedland, a mining town on Western Australia's northwest coast, roughly 1,300 miles from Brisbane. The job promised steady work and decent pay, enough reason to load his blue four-wheel drive vehicle and strike out across one of the most isolated road networks on Earth. He packed conservatively but adequately: bottled water, tinned food, spare fuel, basic tools, and the sort of supplies any experienced Outback driver would carry. He understood the dangers inherent in traveling through the Tanami, a region where help could be hundreds of miles away, and where summer temperatures routinely exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. He planned his route carefully, intending to follow the Bunteen Highway, a lonely ribbon of dirt road cutting northwest through cattle stations and Aboriginal communities toward the border with Western Australia. It was not a journey to be taken lightly, but neither was it extraordinary. The Tanami Desert is not a desert in the sense of endless sand dunes or dramatic sculptural formations. It is, instead, a vast expanse of red dirt plains, sparse spinifex grasslands, scattered acacia trees, and cracked earth stretching across more than 71,000 square miles of the Northern Territory and Western Australia. Geologically ancient, the landscape is flat and featureless, broken only by low rocky outcrops and the occasional dry creek bed that fills briefly during the wet season before evaporating under the relentless sun. The Tanami is a place of extremes. During the day, the sun beats down with merciless intensity, baking the ground until the air shimmers with heat haze, and every shadow becomes a precious commodity. At night, temperatures plummet, and the cold settles into bones with surprising cruelty. Water is the rarest and most valuable resource, sometimes hidden deep underground in aquifers accessed only by bores, sometimes pooling briefly in claypan depressions after rain, but more often simply absent. The region is home to cattle stations so vast they measure tens of thousands of square kilometers, yet human habitation is sparse, limited to isolated homesteads, Aboriginal outstations, and the occasional roadhouse, separated by hundreds of miles. For the Aboriginal people who have lived here for tens of thousands of years, the Tanami is a place rich with meaning. But for the unprepared traveler, it is a landscape that punishes mistakes swiftly and without mercy. By 5:30 p.m. on January 19, 2006, somewhere along the Bunteen Highway, Ricky Megee's journey took a turn he would struggle to explain for the rest of his life. According to the account he gave to rescuers, journalists, and later in his book, he had encountered a hitchhiker, a man standing beside the road in the fading afternoon light. Megee, in an act of generosity that would nearly cost him his life, pulled over, and offered the stranger a ride. The hitchhiker climbed into the vehicle, and they continued northwest together. What happened next, Megee claimed, was a blur of disorientation and confusion. At some point during the journey, he believed the hitchhiker drugged him, either slipping something into his drink or injecting him with a substance that left him dazed, disoriented, and unable to resist. When Megee regained consciousness, had been taken. The last rays of daylight had been taken. The last rays of daylight were fading, and he was utterly alone in a landscape that offered no forgiveness. There was no road in sight. There was no sound except the wind moving through the spinifex. There was no easy way out. Instincts kicked in. Ricky Megee stood up, swaying from the effects of whatever drug had been used on him, and tried to assess his situation. His mouth was dry, his head pounded, and his limbs felt weak and uncoordinated. He scanned the horizon in every direction, but saw only the endless red plains, the low scrub, and the darkening sky. There were no landmarks, no signs of civilization, no indication of which direction might lead to safety. He began to walk, choosing a direction more or less at random, hoping he might stumble across the highway or a cattle station. But the Tanami is vast, and the distances between human habitation are measured in hundreds of kilometers. For the first few days, Megee walked through a landscape that seemed to stretch on forever, unchanging and indifferent. The days were scorching, the sun a physical weight pressing down on his exposed skin. The nights were bitterly cold, and without proper clothing or shelter, he huddled in shallow depressions in the ground, covering himself with dirt and spinifex to conserve what little body heat he had. Hunger set in quickly, a gnawing ache in his belly that grew more insistent with each passing hour. Thirst, however, was the more immediate threat. In the Tanami, a man without water can die within days. With limited options, Megee made a fateful choice. Rather than continue wandering aimlessly, he decided to search for water, the one resource that might keep him alive long enough to find help or be found. He recalled stories he had heard about the Outback, about how Aboriginal people survived by knowing where to find water, even in the driest landscapes. He looked for animal tracks, reasoning that wildlife would lead him to waterholes. He followed bird flights, hoping they would guide him to dams or soaks. And on the fourth or fifth day, exhausted and dehydrated, he found it. A dam. A man-made water reservoir created for cattle, filled with murky, algae-covered water. It was not clean. It was not safe. But it was water. Megee drank deeply, ignoring the foul taste and the knowledge that the water likely contained parasites and bacteria that would sicken him. In that moment, survival outweighed caution. The dam became his base, the anchor point around which the next 71 days of his life would revolve. Ricky Megee's ordeal entered a new phase, one defined not by dramatic events, but by the grinding, exhausting repetition of daily survival. He settled near the dam, constructing a makeshift shelter by digging a shallow pit and covering it with branches, spinifex, and the plastic sheeting he had found himself buried under. The shelter offered minimal protection from the sun during the hottest part of the day, and a slight barrier against the cold at night. It was crude, barely functional, but it was something. Each day began with the same ritual: check the shelter for damage, assess his physical condition, and plan the day's activities. Water was no longer his primary concern, thanks to the dam, but food became the obsession that dominated his waking thoughts. The human body, deprived of calories, begins to consume itself. Fat reserves disappear first, then muscle tissue, and finally, if starvation continues long enough, the body begins to shut down non-essential functions to preserve the brain and heart. Megee could feel himself wasting away, his ribs becoming more prominent, his limbs growing thinner, his energy reserves depleting day by day. He began to eat anything he could catch or find. His first meals were ants, small black insects that he scooped up by the handful and ate raw, crunching them between his teeth and forcing himself to swallow despite the bitter taste. He learned to trap grasshoppers, beetles, and caterpillars, eating them alive or after crushing them to reduce the sensation of legs and wings in his mouth. He discovered that small lizards, skinks that darted across the rocks, could be caught if he moved slowly and struck quickly. He ate them raw, tearing off the heads and consuming the bodies, skin and all. Frogs became a delicacy, relatively easy to catch near the dam in the evening when they emerged to hunt insects. He trapped them with his bare hands, killing them quickly and eating them immediately, savoring the small amount of protein they provided. Leeches, which he found clinging to rocks in the shallows of the dam, were another food source. He pulled them off, squeezed them to remove the blood they had consumed, and swallowed them whole. The act of eating leeches, frogs, and insects was not heroic or cinematic. It was humiliating, nauseating, and necessary. But it kept him alive. Every day, at 1:30 p.m., the sun reached its peak, and the temperature became unbearable. The dam water, which had been cool in the morning, grew warm and stagnant. The shelter, inadequate as it was, became a refuge, the only place where the sun's assault could be marginally endured. Megee would crawl into the pit, pull the plastic sheet over himself, and wait. Hours passed in a state of semi-consciousness, too hot to sleep, too exhausted to move. He rationed his energy, understanding intuitively that every movement cost calories he could not afford to spend. Endure the afternoon. Make it to evening. Repeat. The nights brought relief from the heat, but introduced a new form of suffering. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset, and without proper clothing, Megee shivered uncontrollably. He piled dirt over his legs and torso, using the earth as insulation, and curled into a fetal position to conserve warmth. Sleep came in brief, fitful intervals, interrupted by cold, hunger, and the sounds of the desert at night. The rustle of nocturnal animals, the distant howl of dingoes, the eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The isolation began to take its toll on Megee's mind. Humans are social creatures, and prolonged solitude erodes mental stability in ways that are difficult to predict or control. Megee found himself talking aloud, narrating his actions as if explaining them to an invisible audience. "Right, now we're going to check the traps," he would say. "Let's see if we caught anything today." He sang songs he remembered from childhood, recited bits of poetry he had learned in school, and told himself stories to pass the time. He argued with himself, debating whether to stay near the dam or attempt to walk out, weighing the risks of remaining stationary against the dangers of traveling through unknown terrain. Some days he felt certain that rescue was imminent, that searchers were combing the area and would find him within hours. Other days he was convinced he would die there, that his body would be found months or years later, desiccated and unrecognizable, a cautionary tale for travelers foolish enough to trust strangers. The uncertainty was its own form of torture, a psychological burden as heavy as the physical deprivations he endured. There were near-miss incidents that terrified him. One afternoon, a pack of dingoes approached the dam, their lean bodies moving with predatory grace. Megee, weakened and vulnerable, realized he had no way to defend himself. He shouted, waved his arms, and threw rocks, trying to make himself appear larger and more dangerous than he was. The dingoes circled warily, assessing him with intelligent eyes, before eventually moving on in search of easier prey. Another day, he misjudged his footing while scrambling down a rocky slope and fell, landing hard on his back. For several minutes, He lay stunned, unable to breathe, convinced he had broken something vital. When the pain subsided and he realized he was merely bruised, the relief was overwhelming. He understood with perfect clarity that a serious injury would mean death. There was no hospital, no doctor, no one to help him. He was entirely dependent on his own body's ability to remain functional. As the weeks turned into a month, and then 6 weeks, and then 2 months, Megee adapted. His body, though emaciated, became more efficient at extracting nutrients from the meager diet of insects and amphibians. His senses sharpened, his hearing more acute, his vision better at detecting movement in the scrub. He learned the rhythms of the desert, the times when animals were most active, the patterns of bird flight that indicated water or food sources, the subtle changes in the sky that might signal approaching rain. He became, in a sense, a creature of the Tanami, no longer a visitor, but a resident, shaped by the environment's demands. But adaptation came at a cost. He had lost more than 60 pounds, his body a skeletal frame wrapped in sun-damaged skin. His hair and beard grew wild and unkempt, matted with dirt and debris. His feet, unprotected by shoes, were calloused and scarred, toughened by constant contact with sharp rocks and thorny vegetation. He looked, by his own later admission, like a man who had been dead for weeks. Meanwhile, far from the isolated dam where Ricky Megee clung to survival, the world beyond the Tanami remained oblivious to his plight. In Port Hedland, the job he had been traveling to take remained unfilled, and questions began to arise about his whereabouts. In Brisbane, family and friends grew concerned when he failed to make contact, his phone silent, his vehicle untraceable. But the Outback is vast, and missing persons cases in such remote areas are difficult to investigate. There was no clear indication of where Megee might be, no abandoned vehicle to mark his last known location, no witness to confirm his route. The assumption, initially, was that he had simply changed his plans or encountered mechanical difficulties and would reappear when circumstances allowed. Days turned into weeks, and the lack of news grew more ominous. But without evidence of foul play or a clear starting point for a search, authorities could do little. Back in the Tanami, Megee had no way of knowing that anyone was looking for him, or that his disappearance had been noted at all. He continued his daily routine, driven by a hope that was increasingly difficult to sustain. He tried to create signals that might be visible from the air, arranging rocks into crude patterns, building small cairns, dragging branches to form arrows pointing toward his location. He told himself that rescue was only a matter of time, that eventually someone would see the signs and come to investigate. But as March turned into April and the 70-day mark approached, even that hope began to fade. He considered walking out, attempting to reach the Bunteen Highway or one of the cattle stations he knew existed somewhere beyond the horizon. But he also understood that leaving the dam meant leaving his only reliable water source, and that the distances involved could be fatal. He had survived this long by staying put. Moving now might be the mistake that killed him. On April 5, 2006, 71 days after his ordeal began, Ricky Megee heard the sound of an engine. At first, he thought it was another hallucination, his mind playing tricks as it had done so many times before. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, and he realized it was real. A vehicle was approaching. He stumbled out of his shelter, waving his arms, shouting hoarsely, his voice cracked and weak from disuse. The vehicle, a utility truck belonging to stockmen from Barandudu Station, slowed as the workers noticed movement near the dam. They stopped, uncertain what they were seeing. The figure that staggered toward them looked barely human, a skeletal apparition with wild hair, sunburned skin, and clothing reduced to rags. For a moment, the stockmen simply stared, trying to process what they were witnessing. Then recognition set in. This was a man, somehow alive and in desperate need of help. The workers rushed forward, offering water and what little food they had in the truck. Megee drank greedily, his body crying out for fluids it had been denied for so long. He was mumbling, disoriented, his words difficult to understand. The stockman asked him who he was, how he had come to be there, and Megee tried to explain, but the story came out in fragments, confused and incomplete. They realized he was in severe distress and needed immediate medical attention. A call was made, and within hours, the Royal Flying Doctor Service dispatched an aircraft to Barandudu Station. Ricky Megee was airlifted to Royal Darwin Hospital, where doctors encountered a patient unlike any they had seen before. Megee's physical condition was shocking. He weighed just over 105 pounds, having lost more than 60 pounds from his pre-ordeal weight. His body mass index was in the severely underweight range, his muscles wasted, his fat reserves completely depleted. He was dehydrated despite having access to the dam, the result of drinking water contaminated with parasites and bacteria that had caused chronic diarrhea. His skin was severely sunburned, cracked and peeling in places, with evidence of repeated exposure to extreme heat. His feet were a mass of calluses, cuts, and scars, testament to weeks of walking barefoot over rough terrain. Blood tests revealed malnutrition, dehydration, and the presence of intestinal parasites. Yet, remarkably, there were no life-threatening injuries, no broken bones, no infections that could not be treated with antibiotics. One nurse, seeing him for the first time, remarked that he looked like a survivor from a World War II prisoner of war camp, a man who had been starved and exposed to the elements for months. Doctors described him as someone who had come back from the edge, a man whose body had been pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. Despite everything, Ricky Megee recovered quickly, at least physically. Within days, he was talking, eating solid food, and even joking with hospital staff. His mental resilience, it seemed, had carried him through the ordeal and continued to serve him in the aftermath. But as news of his survival spread, questions began to emerge. His story, while dramatic, contained inconsistencies and gaps that troubled authorities. Initially, when first rescued, Megee told the stockman that his car had broken down and he had simply walked away from it, becoming lost. But later, in the hospital, he changed his account, claiming he had been drugged by a hitchhiker and deliberately abandoned. Police investigators found the shifting narrative suspicious. They launched an investigation, searching for evidence of the hitchhiker, the attack, and the abandoned vehicle, but found nothing. No vehicle matching Megee's description was located along the Bunteen Highway or in the surrounding areas. No witnesses came forward to report seeing him with a hitchhiker. No physical evidence supported the claim of drugging or assault. The media caught wind of the story, and suddenly Ricky Megee became a national sensation. Newspapers ran headlines proclaiming his miraculous survival. Television programs interviewed him, and the public was captivated by the tale of a man who had endured 71 days in one of Australia's most hostile environments. But alongside the fascination came skepticism. Some questioned whether the story was true, whether Megee had fabricated or embellished the details to cover up some other explanation for his disappearance. Others wondered if he had been involved in criminal activity, drug smuggling or something worse, and had invented the hitchhiker story to explain his presence in the Tanami. Police continued their investigation, but ultimately found no evidence of wrongdoing and closed the case. Whether Megee had been the victim of a crime or the author of his own misfortune remained, and remains, a mystery. In 2008, Ricky Megee published a book titled Left for Dead: How I Survived 71 Days in the Outback, co-written with Greg McLean. The book provided a detailed account of his ordeal, describing the isolation, the hunger, the hallucinations, and the near madness that threatened to overwhelm him. It painted a vivid picture of the Tanami as a place of stark beauty and brutal indifference, a landscape that punishes mistakes and offers no second chances. Megee described the psychological toll of prolonged solitude, the conversations he had with himself, the moments of despair when he believed death was inevitable, and the small acts of willpower that kept him moving forward. The book was part memoir, part survival manual, and part meditation on what it means to endure when all hope seems lost. Critics and readers were divided. Some found it compelling and believable, a testament to human resilience. Others remained unconvinced, pointing to the lack of corroborating evidence and the implausibility of certain details. Ricky Megee's story is one not of heroism in the traditional sense, but of persistence when all agency had been stripped away. He did not conquer the Tanami Desert through skill or bravery. He survived by adapting to its rhythms, by accepting his situation and focusing on the immediate tasks required to stay alive. Find water, find food, build shelter, endure. There was no grand strategy, no moment of dramatic triumph, only the grinding, exhausting repetition of survival's basic requirements. In the face of isolation, exposure, and the slow erosion of his body, he chose to continue. And in doing so, he outlasted the desert's indifference. The Tanami took 60 pounds of his flesh, his dignity, and months of his life. It did not take his will to see another sunrise. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you rethink what the human body and mind can endure, please take a moment to like the video. It really helps the channel reach more people. And if you want more true stories of survival, resilience, and the extremes of human experience, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.